Instancing and referencing in 3ds Max refers to a situation where two or more objects share some or all of their characteristics. This can include their geometry, their modifiers, and even their transforms in some circumstances. Instancing can happen in 3ds Max in a number of ways, mainly via the graphical user interface, but also via MaxScript when finer manipulation or mass application of instancing or referencing is needed. Let's quickly define what the terms instancing and referencing mean. There are three main uses of the term instance in 3ds Max. Firstly, an object such as a procedural teapot, an editable poly, or a NURB surface is deemed to be instanced when all of its main nodes are the same as another scene object, with only its transform node being unique to itself to allow it to have a position, rotation, and scale of its own. You can actually see that in action here in this scene. Here is one teapot, and as you can see, it's got a bunch of different modifiers on it, which actually lead to this strange kind of spiky shape that we have here. You can see we've got a base object, which is a teapot, then it is tapered, then it has an editable poly applied, which actually does these spikes, and then we've got a turbo smooth applied. Now, if we look at this object over here, you'll actually see exactly the same stack. We've got a teapot with a taper, an editable poly, and a turbo smooth. And if we go into the taper and modify the taper amount, you can actually see that both teapots are changing. If I go up to the editable poly and let's say I mute it for a second, you can see that this teapot over here has also had its editable poly muted as well. And well, I'll just turn that back on. If I go up to turbo smooth and turn that off, you can see that both actually have that action taking place. So as you can see, at this point they're both sharing every single aspect of their makeup, their base object, their stack. All of these elements are shared, and as you can see, it's only the transform nodes which are different, which actually allow the objects to be in different parts of our scene. The second usage is when a modifier is shared between more than one object in a scene. In this case, the same modifier node is used in more than one stack, and when this is the case, the modifier is described as being instanced. Now, in this example, you can see we have the same teapot again. If we look at the stack, you can see it's the same as before. We've got the base object, we've got a taper, an editable poly, and turbo smooth. But in this case, you'll notice that the taper modifier has actually got italicized text. And that indicates that it's actually an instanced modifier. It shows that it's actually used elsewhere in the scene. And you can see that when I select it, this teapot over here is actually showing a taper gizmo. And that's because the actual taper modifier has actually been instanced over here as well. So again, if I click on the base object, you can see the object looks perfectly normal. And when I click on the taper, you can see it's showing the gizmo. And it's also showing the gizmo over here on the first teapot, I should say. Now, if I actually go in and modify the amount of the taper, you can see it's affecting both teapots. And as I've just said, that's quite simply because the same node, the same taper modify node, is actually shared between these two teapots. It's actually used in both. So as you can see, it's actually possible to very easily instance modifiers as well as gross objects. Let's have a look at our third example now. The third scenario is when a single controller is shared between multiple nodes. In this case, the controller can be connected to any number of scene nodes, and in many cases it would not also be plugged into a similar parameter. So as an example, on one object the controller could be defining the object's radius, whilst on another object it could actually define its x position or any other kind of parameter which uses a floating point value in that example. In any case, when a controller is used in more than one node, it's deemed to be instance. So if we again look at our example, you can see we've got the original stack again, and we've got the teapot with the taper, editable poly, and turbo smooth on top. Now you can't actually see any visible evidence of instancing in this case, but beforehand I've actually set up these objects so there is actually some instancing going on in the controllers. I've actually gone in and I've taken the radius parameter here and I've applied a controller to it, and then I've copied that controller and I've pasted it over here onto the radius parameter of the teapot here. And I've also done the same thing with the taper amount here, this value here. You can see I've copied across the taper modifier. It's not actually an instance, it's actually a copy. And you can see there's a table modifier there. And just to show that those controllers are actually instance, I'll go down to the teapot and I'll just change the radius value. And as you can see, both teapots are changing size. And that's because, as I said, the radius value is actually instance between them. Just using that instancing of the controller. And if I go onto the taper and modify the amount, again you can see both are changing. And that's again because I've actually instanced that controller across both modifiers, as you can see. Now if I go down to the curve value and change that, you'll see that only the teapot on the left is changing, and that's because the actual curve parameter isn't instanced across. I haven't actually gone in and done that. I haven't instanced that across to the other object. Now let's actually do something a little bit strange here, and we'll actually just apply this manually ourselves. I'll go in here and I'll apply a twist modifier. There we go. And you can see it's got an angle value here, and I'm actually going to instance that across to this object over here. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to go down to the taper, and we'll just change. Let's see, can we get positive values? Yes, we can. Okay, so I'm going to go into the curve editor, which I'll just bring up here. And I'm going to go into the modified object, navigate down to the taper modifier, go down to the curvature value, which you can see here. At the moment it doesn't actually have a controller assigned. So I'm going to right click, assign controller. I'm going to assign a Bezier flow controller there, and then I'm going to copy that and just close this window, and we'll go across over to this object, and I'll open up the curve editor again, and it'll be focused on this teapot now. Go down to the modified object. Now we've got a twist modifier here, so I'll open that up, and it's actually going to be the angle that I'm going to apply it to. I'm going to paste, and you can see we've got the option here of pasting it as a copy or an instance, and I'm going to choose an instance in this case. I'm going to OK that, and now I've actually instanced the controller from the taper curvature value here, and I've actually instanced it into the twist angle value here. So if I change the twist angle value, you can see it's actually changing because the twist value needs to be quite a large value to have a noticeable effect. You can see I actually as I move it, it's actually having very little effect on the teapot. But conversely, the curvature value needs to be quite a small value, and so as I move that, you can see it has quite a large effect over here. So as you can see, as I'm moving the curvature value, it's having a small effect on the teapot over here, and that's because those two parameters are now using the same controller. Okay, so those are the three different versions of instancing. Now it's worth bearing in mind in each of those scenarios that you can say that the instance data is actually identical in all cases, and so for practical purposes there's no real original or master instance that you can actually say controls all the other instances. In this particular case, all the instances are equal, and you can go to any one of them and change the values in it, and that will actually update all the other instances. So there's no one single controlling instance that for instance, if you get rid of that instance, it breaks all the others. It doesn't actually work like that. When you're actually making an instance, either an object or a modifier or a controller, what you're actually doing is you're copying that particular node, and you're duplicating it in the scene, and you're reusing that data in a number of different nodes throughout that scene. So as you can see, it's a very powerful feature. Now let's move on and have a look at referencing, which is actually a very similar feature but slightly different. When an object is referenced in 3ds Max, 3ds Max creates a link between the stack of the original object and its new copy. The newly referenced object shares all of the stack data of the original object that it was actually referenced from. And to show this, the stack in the reference object displays a horizontal line above the last modifier in its stack derived from the original object. You're